Welcome. My name is Glennis Chester, and I am your host for the NFRW Empower Hour. This is the program that provides in-depth discussions on issues that are forefront in today's culture, giving you the tools to speak with authority on important political topics. So for those of you who joined us in June, our program on the unholy trinity, drugs, cartels, and open borders produced really great feedback. I really was amazed at how many people texted me and emailed me, called me. It was definitely one of our most difficult programs to date, but it was so important that we are equipped with current and accurate information, even when it's a little bit scary to see and hear, which it definitely was. But tonight, we're going to discuss legalizing marijuana. So if it seems like every state has legalized marijuana to some degree, you're not wrong. As of April, I think there's only maybe 5 states that have 0 programs for legal marijuana usage. And I know personally, I had very strong feelings opposing legalizing pot. And then somehow over the years, and I don't even know when, I just sort of gave up. And we were just discussing this. I just decided it was a foregone conclusion that it was going to happen. So why bother? There's all these other issues that I should be fighting for. And it wasn't like I decided not to fight for it anymore or fight against it anymore. I just stopped talking about it. And you know what? I think I was gaslighted. And I think maybe we all were, because I think that's how all of these laws are being enacted, is that there's so much misinformation out there and it gets thrown at us over and over and over again until we either start believing it or it kind of numbs us to the point that we think there's no reason to fight against it anymore. So to get us back on the straight and narrow and tell us what is really the truth, I'm really excited to bring back Jeffrey Stamm. His work on the front lines fighting against drug cartels, both with the DEA and other agencies, have given him a clear and honest perspective against drug usage and the effects of marijuana on our communities. But before I turn it over to our speaker, we want to do our little housekeeping that we always do. Please keep yourselves muted. If you have questions, please type them into the chat feature and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the program. And as always, a huge thank you to Erica Watley and Ken Bowers. You are the Wonder Women that make this happen. They are the tech support for the program, and I couldn't do it without you both. And finally, please don't forget to let your clubs know that every episode that we do of Empower Hour and Bite-Sized Tools is available in the digital resource library on the NFRW website. So that's a mouthful, but you can find it. Just get on the website and everything is right there. So quick recap of Jeffrey's bio. While he was with the DEA, he had assignments everywhere from California and Texas to foreign regions like Pakistan and Afghanistan. So he has been all over and seen everything. At DEA HQ, he served as a deputy chief of international operations and ultimately as a special agent in charge of the Global Aviation Division. Following his retirement, okay, so this is after he retired from the DEA in 2016, he was appointed as the executive director of the Midwest High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area for the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. That also is a mouthful. Up until 2022, at which time he decided to retire again, I think for real this time. Anyway, but he still comes and talks to people and educates us on drug cartels and trafficking and marijuana usage and how it affects our community. So we are so very lucky to have him with us. And Jeff, thank you so much for visiting with us again tonight. Let's talk pot. We got you muted. I think we've got you muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there we go.
Glennis, thank you very much for having me back. I'm actually happy and honored to be back with your group of patriots across the country. All of your patriotic women in the National Federation of Republican Women's, and I know we've got some men out there as well. So I'm honored to once again be with you. I actually don't believe that there's a topic in modern America today that has a greater chasm between reality and what people believe to be true than on the marijuana issue. And as Friedrich Nietzsche once said, sometimes people don't want to hear the truth because they don't wish to have their illusions destroyed. So this presentation tonight is really just about trying to separate the illusions from the truth. We do have a few, just a handful of slides that you saw last time if you were in the last presentation relative to drugs, borders, cartels, because the marijuana issue is inseparable from all those as well. But we have much more new information. And by the way, we don't have any of those terribly graphic slides that we had last time as well. So hopefully you'll be happy to hear that. But we're going to take a journey together tonight that will shed new light on the entire marijuana issue that I believe will make the choice absolutely clear. First slide, please. Now this, I want to start with this first quote from Dr. Robert DuPont. He happened to be the head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse from 1973 to 1978. When he was first given that position by Richard Nixon, he actually believed that marijuana was not really a problem at all, not anything that the federal government should even bother looking at, especially in light of the tremendous problems we had back then with heroin, burgeoning methamphetamine, and cocaine about to burst on the scene. But ultimately, by the time he finished his tour, after having become tremendously more acquainted with marijuana and the damage it does to both the individual and society, he had actually made that statement right there that he believes marijuana is actually the most dangerous drug of all. Not because it's the most toxic and the most directly dangerous, like heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, but because it's the most insidious, having the slow and subtle ability to degrade and decay and enslave individual users. So he came to that conclusion, along with the belief that it's also the most misunderstood drug of all, which obviously causes people to underestimate the problems with the drug. Next slide. Well, the first thing we have to look at is we're not just talking about 1960s Woodstock weed anymore. The average purity level traditionally throughout millennia in naturally occurring marijuana is about 1 to 2% THC. And what most people don't realize that in traditional wild marijuana, the proportion of THC to cannabidiol or CBD is roughly 1 to 1. And that CBD actually throughout time has had the ability to limit, to mitigate the psychoactivity of marijuana as it counteracts somewhat the THC. But over the years, marijuana enthusiasts have figured out how to coax ever more increasing amounts of THC from the cannabis plant with ever more innovative botanical innovations as well as cultivation techniques. The average purity level today is 18% across the nation. That's average, with some California and Colorado producers able to coax as much as 30% THC out of the marijuana plant. Next slide. Regular marijuana users have actually doubled in the last decade. We're approaching the numbers that we haven't seen since the late 1970s. But it's important to know that as those numbers rise, we're not just talking about 1970s marijuana. Once again, it's roughly 4 to 5 times the purity level as what it was back then. Marijuana is not just a gateway drug. Sure, it's all of that. But given modern THC levels with such tremendous psychoactivity, science has shown that much of today's modern marijuana acts as a kind of catalyst that primes the brain for other types of psychoactive substances. You know, in 1980, when Ronald Reagan was elected, certainly he recognized the damage that drugs both use and trafficking, were causing to society. So he and First Lady Nancy Reagan began the Just Say No program, designed to try to head off kids, young youth across the United States from a path of chemical enslavement or worse in their lives. Now, although the Just Say No program was highly mocked and vilified by our elites and media at the time as being a ridiculous counter to the Colombian cartels, President Reagan knew that it wasn't designed to counter the cartels. That was law enforcement's job, but rather it was designed to teach kids that they could lead safe, healthy, lawful lifestyles instead of making terrible decisions. So I ask you, who in the White House today, who in the federal government today is telling kids to just say no? Not just with marijuana, but especially with modern substances like fentanyl, where one pill can kill, that if they don't say no, that they could die. Next. Now, clearly, marijuana use in legalized states results in increased, not just use, but addiction. It's time to explode the notion that marijuana is not physically addictive. There's still a lot of people out there that say it's not. It is in every way. And I need to point out before I go any farther that, you know, our policy options relative to marijuana don't necessarily revolve only between complete legalization or imprisoning millions of our fellow citizens simply for using drugs. We haven't done that for decades now. But there are so many policy options in between: civil fines, drug courts, infractions, a broad continuum that municipalities, state government, federal government can continue to employ. Total legalization is not our only option. In fact, relative to arresting all drug dealers, much of our society finds it, well, distasteful that we have to arrest drug traffickers in our society today. But I would argue that our policy options don't revolve between the good versus the bad, but rather policy options that revolve between those that are distasteful and catastrophic. Next slide. Now, I call marijuana the cultural fault line of our time because roughly half of our population, maybe a little bit more today, believes that legalizing marijuana in our society can all in all be a good thing. Well, I believe that half of our population have actually been duped, pawns in a colossal con at the hands of legalizers promoting a soothing fairy tale. Can you go back? There we go. The marijuana law legalization lobby has been surprisingly effective using two things: an appeal to emotion and endless repetition. By the way, those are the two key components to propaganda: an appeal to emotion and endless repetition. Not to mention, by the way, a whole bunch of money from, next slide, people like George Soros, multi-billionaire from the far left, clearly out to achieve a one world socialist government, the mass immigration, open borders, the demobilization of the American military. And by the way, his favorite objective is the legalization of all drugs in our society, not just marijuana. Known as Daddy Weed Bucks to the marijuana folks, because he's personally contributed over $100 million putting legalization efforts on every ballot across the state. Some successful, some not. But clearly, he's out to transform American society, and he's doing a darn good job of it. Next slide. Most people don't realize that George Soros is also hugely supportive of far left agendas, like supporting radical district attorneys across the country to undermine our criminal justice system from within. He's actually elected, thanks to his donations and his promotions, 75 district attorneys across the United States. And by the way, those 75 jurisdictions represent collectively 72 million Americans. That's roughly 1/5 of our entire population. Now, having lost access to the White House in 2016 with the election of with the election of Donald Trump, excuse me, George Soros simply lifted and shifted and concentrated his focus at the local level, electing 75 district attorneys once again to undermine the system from within. It's also known, thanks to much of the investigative journalism from Matt Colombo, that an organization called the Open Society Foundation, primarily supported by George Soros, contributed hugely to the riots in 2020 following the death of George Floyd. As we know, those riots were now, 3 years later, not completely organic or entirely spontaneous. George Soros provided $35 million through the Open Society Foundation to dozens of cutout corporations and front companies designed to fund the paid stormtroopers of the far left to foment and continue riots across the United States for as long as possible in the summer of 2020. When it was all said and done, a total of 537 riots had ensued, resulting in 26 people dead, $2 billion in arson and property damage, as well as the maiming and injuring of over 2,000 cops. He truly was designed to transform society by undermining law enforcement from within, by henceforth describing it as systemically racist and institutionally oppressive. Next slide. Now, of all the arguments put forth by the marijuana legalization over the years, both those supposed benefits that would accrue to society, as well as none of the negatives that ever would, have all been complete lies. And whether the legalizers were intentionally designing to mislead the public or simply misguided, a lie is still a lie. And of all the lies, and the biggest con of all is that last one right there, that legalizing marijuana in the US would dry up the biggest cash crop of all for the Mexican cartels. And they would simply dry up and blow away or become so minimally relevant to law enforcement in America that they would no longer be a problem. So let's take a look at what happened when we legalized marijuana in the US, how the Mexican cartels adapted and evolved, engaged in both the vertical and horizontal integration of markets. Next slide. The first thing they did was simply transfer cultivation operations to within the US, especially those very lax cultivation states of California, Oregon, and Washington. 90% of the marijuana coming out of California today comes off of what's called trespass grows, where organized crime simply moves in and takes over large swaths of land in national forests, state parks, private property, fouling the environment in every way, clear-cutting forests to grow marijuana, siltifying the streams, and sucking up all the available surface water, killing and decimating our steelhead and salmon population. Second thing they did, now certainly marijuana is not legal in Mexico per se, but with all of the other organized crime and terrorist issues they have in Mexico, not to mention tremendous amounts of corruption, marijuana is simply out of control in that country. So the cartels simply began to market weed to their own populations. In fact, one of the biggest marijuana extract companies in Mexico right now, a company called Paradise, is actually partly owned by former Mexican President Vicente Fox himself. Number three, you think the Mexicans would simply plow under their marijuana fields and begin to grow avocados? No, think again. They simply went out in search of new international markets, not just the highly lucrative customers in Western Europe, but all over Latin America, to include the largest drug market in all of the Western Hemisphere, second only to the US, Brazil. Now, Mexican cartels for a long time have had relationships with Brazilian organized crime, particularly the Red Brigade, or Comando Vermelho as they're called, in moving cocaine into and through Brazil to West Africa to move loads of cocaine into Western Europe. So they simply use those relationships to begin marketing marijuana inside Brazil as well. Number 4, here's the big one. According to a 2019 Rand Corporation study, legalizing weed inside the US is partly what drove the Mexican cartels to expand into synthetics. First, beginning with methamphetamine in the 1990s, and now, as we know so well today, fentanyl, xylazine, and God knows what else is around the corner. Now, certainly, the far left has been highly critical for many years over what they consider to be blowback or unintended consequences of America's war on drugs. But I ask you, who's holding the marijuana legalization folks accountable for this blowback that they've caused? Next slide, please. Now, this slide you may recognize from last time. Every year, Americans spend $150 billion a year buying illegal drugs. And yes, that still includes ton quantities of marijuana coming across the border. Now, it's true that the amount of marijuana smuggled across the Mexican border into the US is only a fraction of what it used to be. In fact, last year it was 155,000 pounds seized by CBP at the Mexican border. But there's, as I just said, there's tremendous amounts of marijuana cultivated inside the US by Mexican cartels. Ultimately, about half of that $150 billion a year finds its way into the Mexican drug cartels, into their bank accounts. And that kind of money doesn't just destabilize Mexico. It allows the Mexican transnational criminal groups to be more powerful than the very federal government itself across vast swaths of that country, including the entirety of the Mexican-US border. Now, you remember the Colombian cartels of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. You obviously remember how incredibly efficient they were at combining new levels of violence with international drug trafficking. But today, the Mexicans make them look like pikers. In addition to even more acute levels of violence that clearly transcend the threshold of what we define as terrorism, the Mexicans have become highly adept at what global economists describe as market diversification, both the vertical and horizontal integration of markets. Vertically meaning they want to dominate every level of the supply chain, from production, transportation, smuggling across borders, wholesale distribution, even retail level sales, not just here in the US, but increasingly the world. But also horizontally, branching out into new types of drugs not traditional to Mexico, as we've just mentioned, methamphetamine and fentanyl, but also beyond drugs themselves into new types of organized crime, illegal mining, logging, fishing, the illegal trafficking of exotic and endangered species to China. And especially in the last 2.5 years, given the incredible profitability of human trafficking, engaging in the trafficking of human beings into the US. Now, a lot of people don't realize that the United States, in terms of market language, is actually the greatest customer for human trafficking in the world. Not just the direct products of human beings, but also some of those indirect products like child pornography. And we know it's the same organizations that are engaged in the same type of human trafficking, the vile business of sex slavery and child exploitation, as those engaged in drug trafficking. So for anyone who argues that we can solve either of those problems, drug trafficking or human trafficking, with simply more treatment and prevention, rather than the full weight and application of US law, especially at the border, is guilty of both moral and intellectual cowardice. Next slide. Now, DEA puts this map out from time to time showing cartel presence, ownership really, of many of our big cities across the US. But for the most part, this map just depicts DEA's large division offices. It's actually Homeland Security that's estimated that the various Mexican cartels have a presence in over 3,000 American cities and towns in all 50 states. They are here solely to sell drugs to Americans and engage in other types of organized crime. I can think of no greater modern example of Cicero's warning to his fellow citizens about allowing an enemy within the gates. Next slide. Now, this study done out of the Midwest in 2020 found what so many previous studies have found over the years, going as far back as the late 1960s with criminologists like James Q. Wilson, that as much as 2/3 of all crime in the US, both property and violent crime, is directly attributable to drug use and/or drug trafficking. 2/3. So if you're looking for the greatest crime control strategy that we can employ, it's drug control. And I'm not just talking about law enforcement drug control, but all three legs of our proverbial three-legged stool, combining treatment, prevention, and enforcement. All of those three work together in synergy if we can do it correctly. Next slide. There are three general models relative to the drugs crime nexus in society. The first, the psychopharmacological, argues that people commit irrational or unlawful acts after ingesting certain psychoactive substances. Clearly, alcohol and marijuana fall into that category. The second, the economic model, maintains that people engage in crime to be able to buy drugs or to lead a drug-infused lifestyle absent the responsibilities of normal citizenship. The third, the systemic model, argues that given their illegality, there's an inherent level of violent criminal behavior that surrounds the business of drug trafficking. It is this third systemic model that is so often cited by the left as the entirety of our drug crisis, while they conspicuously and disingenuously ignore the first two. And by the way, those first two cause far more damage to society than the latter. Next slide. Now, this graph was just put out just a couple of months ago by the London-based Financial Times, showing the shocking, truly shocking outlier of what youth in America have relative to untimely deaths. They outliers not just in terms of other age groups, but the same age group in peer countries of Western Europe. They even go so far as to point out that 1 in 25 American young people today will not live to see 40 years old. That's not just shocking, it's shameful that we have that in our society today. Now, this is driven by two things, both of which, by the way, are fueled by the weed culture in our society. The first is the recreational use of fentanyl. The second is the recreational use of guns, emulating the gang lifestyle. Now, both of those have been described by one social observer as not deaths of despair, but rather their opposite, deaths of exuberance. It is the do it if it feels good mentality on steroids, where people think that they're able to do anything with their bodies, anything at all relative to individual liberty without corresponding responsibilities. And once again, where are the critics of trying to stem these root causes of crime? Next slide. Now, the exceptionally tolerant people of the Netherlands have long lectured the US as to what sane drug policy looks like. Throughout the 80s, 90s, and even the 2000s, the Dutch have stood up their supposed coffee houses all across their country, where people can use and purchase marijuana legally. At the peak, there were a total of about 1,200 coffee houses across the Netherlands in a country with a population of about 17 million people. To put that in perspective, in our country, relative to the population numbers we have, that would be the equivalent of about 25,000 legal weed stores across the country, roughly twice as many Starbucks as we currently have in the nation. But over time, the Dutch authorities began to slowly realize that that was a bad idea. Not only was drug use skyrocketing across the country, enslaving and degrading so much of the Dutch youth, but it had also been inviting in organized crime of every type into their nation, not just the Italian mafia, but Turkish, Albanian, Greek, Russian, Nigerian organized crime, and then, of course, the Colombian variety, bringing in cocaine, and now tremendous amounts of Mexican cartel activity bringing in cocaine and methamphetamine. And you don't read about it much today, but the Dutch authorities have closed all but a few, just a handful of these marijuana dispensaries throughout their country, trying to improve their nation. In fact, recently, Theodore Dalrymple, a criminal psychologist, described Amsterdam as one of the most violent and squalid cities in all the world, not just Europe, but in all the world. Much of that ushered in by the legal marijuana distribution. But that sentence there at the bottom by that former Dutch authority doesn't just encapsulate the Dutch mindset. In my opinion, it actually perfectly reflects today's modern progressive leftist mindset. Just think about how they try to control things like homelessness and open borders and crime and drug use simply by allowing it. And as we know, there are many things in life that cannot simply be allowed, or civil society will cease to exist. Next slide. Now we're starting to hear some dissent in both the medical and scientific communities that drug addiction is actually a disease of the brain. Well, the brain disease model may actually be wrong for two reasons. Unlike diseases such as cancer or Parkinson's, which have a cause or a genesis in either genetic or pathogenic components, pathogenic meaning caused by a virus, bacteria, or some other microorganism. Drug addiction, on the other hand, is actually brought on by repeated, voluntary, and in most cases, illegal acts designed for some short-term pleasure. So for this reason, increasing numbers of scientists believe that drug addiction belongs in the category of a syndrome, where they also place schizophrenia or depression. Also, maladies of the human brain, yet have no genetic or pathogenic component. Number two, surrendering to the notion that we have a disease allows us to believe that we're victims, we're not in control, that it's somehow somebody else's fault. And as we know in today's society, victims can justify any and all government caring and benevolent programs in the name of compassion and equity. But much of today's intelligentsia is entirely wed to this brain disease model for one simple reason, because it allows them to not have to confront the kind of human evil that has a face. Next slide. Like the drug dealers who fuel those addictions. And as the great conservative writer George Will once said, a society that flinches from the face of evil will also flinch from the act of punishment. Next slide. Now, today's exploding homeless problem in our country is actually, as you already know, a crisis of addiction. It's been estimated that 80% of our homeless population across the country are addicted to opioids. The other 20% to meth, coke, weed, alcohol, or possibly some combination of all the above. In Los Angeles County alone, 75,000 people live clustered in these squalid and filthy, violent tent cities like this, ushering in diseases not seen since medieval times: typhus, bubonic plague, leprosy, not to mention skyrocketing levels of crime for miles around. It's been said that our city leaders in these places are completely paralyzed with indecision about what to do about this problem. No, they're actually paralyzed with their own tolerance. Their only answer thus far is to put out more and more in the lock zone, more harm reduction strategies that ultimately make the problem worse. And of course, a continual strategy of obfuscation and denial. The Office of National Drug Control Policy estimates that the average heavy opioid user spends more than $1,800 a month buying his illegal drugs. So using this as our baseline, we can actually extrapolate out that the various Mexican cartels earn nearly $2 billion a year just supplying these West Coast homeless populations from San Diego up to Seattle with heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamine, and marijuana. That's why they're lined up servicing these camps, further exacerbating the problem. Folks, this has been allowed to flourish, not because of the compassionate, benevolent, progressive policies of our big blue cities have been incompletely applied, but rather because they've been perfectly applied. Next slide. Now, the science is absolutely unassailable, showing the connection between marijuana use and future opioid addiction. Now, this slide's a little bit out of date, doesn't show fentanyl, but the science shows that marijuana users have 3 times the likelihood of developing an opioid addiction. Marijuana is not just a gateway drug. Sure, it's all of that. But with modern THC levels, increasing numbers of studies are showing that marijuana is acting as kind of a catalyst that primes the brain for other types of psychoactive substances. America doesn't just have an opioid problem, it has a drug problem. Next slide. And the science is also unequivocal, showing a nexus between heavy marijuana use and 5 times the likelihood of developing schizophrenia. Marijuana users have 5 times the likelihood of developing psychosis, such as schizophrenia. The most recent, probably landmark study out there is a 2019 study published in the Lancet Medical Journal out of the UK, showing those numbers. But I think if you go back and look at all of the mass school shootings in this country, not all mass shootings, but mass school shootings with these young adolescent males, not adolescents, but young males, going as far back as Columbine in Colorado in the late 1990s, to Aurora, Colorado, Sandy Hook, Parkland, Florida, Uvalde, Texas, University of Virginia. All of these school shooters were heavy potheads that had developed schizophrenia. Is anybody talking about trying to stem that root cause instead of just gun control? Next slide. Dr. Roni Lev out of San Diego's chief of emergency medicine there at San Diego Regional Hospital has coined the term scromating, which is a layman's term for this cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, where grotesquely multiple patients every night in California come into the ER room suffering from the horrific symptom of simultaneously screaming and vomiting. It is a new syndrome that they're seeing brought on by heavy marijuana smokers, especially with moderate THC levels. You know, a lot of people think that marijuana use decreases nausea and decreases one's propensity for violence. Well, that may be true in yesterday's marijuana, but heavy use in today's weed actually produces the opposite of both of those. Next slide. Now, you know, you hit a nerve when High Times Magazine takes a shot at you. I did a presentation back in 2017 in Washington, D.C., which actually got posted on the internet. And the very next month, High Times Magazine, took a shot at me, calling me essentially an idiot for taking a public health, public safety standpoint relative to not just marijuana, but all drugs. But that single sentence right there in that article perfectly sums up their entire drug-infused mentality, that they think government's job should not be to stand in the way of drug use, unlimited drug use of any type, but rather to set up ever more caring and compassionate programs to rescue us all, with taxpayer dollars, by the way, from the harms of drugs. That's a special kind of stupid, in my opinion. Next slide. And speaking of stupid, the 2012 National Academy of Sciences study definitively showed, and by the way, there's been study after study since that time that have shown the same thing, that marijuana smoking or marijuana use in adolescent years can reduce IQ up to 8 points permanently. There you have it. That's why it's called dope. It makes you stupid. It makes you burned out, stupefied, and lazy. Marijuana is turning an entire generation of our young Americans into a dumbed down segment of society, something we all suffer from. Next slide. But we're made to believe that our prisons are filled with drug users, that mass incarceration has been spawned by the drug war. These aren't just misguided notions, they're dangerous lies. On any given day in our country, there are roughly 1.4 million people behind bars in all of our state prisons in all 50 states. And of that total, less than 13% are actually there for drug offenses. But that's not the figure I want you to look at. I want you to look at the other side of that equation. 87% of our state inmates across the country are there for rape, robbery, murder, grand larceny, aggravated assault. Ladies and gentlemen, our prisons are not filled with mere drug users. They're not even filled with drug traffickers. They're filled with violent criminals and serial thieves. And they are exactly where they need to be if we care anything at all about the protection of our society. Next slide. And you remember how legalizing weed was supposed to free up the cops to do real police work? Well, look what happened in the city of Denver in just the first 2 years after Colorado legalized weed. Crime exploded, not just property crime, but violent crime, homicide up 87%. And because apparently there's no shortage of people willing to do anything for a good bowl full of Colorado weed, prostitution is up triple digits. And by the way, these stats and similar numbers are repeated over and over again as states legalize weed across the country. And we are willfully blind to the statistics that keep showing up over and over. Next slide. Now, even mom and pop marijuana legalizers for years worried that maybe one day legalized weed would be so overtaken by corporate America that it would lead to what they called the Budweiserization or the Marlboroization of the marijuana trade. And that's exactly what's happened. We have investors lining up, putting millions, tens of millions of dollars into the marijuana trade in legalized states across the country, further exacerbating marketing and cultivation strategies among the producers, as well as millions of dollars going into lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C., trying to get marijuana legalized at the federal level. Next slide. How many of you recognize or realize that John Boehner, former Republican Speaker of the House, is probably the most prolific lobbyist right now, representing big marijuana, trying to get marijuana legalized at the federal level? He wasn't hired for his marketing savvy or his botanical skills. No, he was hired for his Rolodex to lobby his former pals on Capitol Hill to try to get the federal laws changed. Fortunately, thus far, he's not been successful, but they keep coming back, pushing year after year. As far as I'm concerned, please excuse my language, he's become nothing but a whore to the marijuana industry. Next slide. Now, if you like what the big pharmaceutical companies brought to us relative to the opioid crisis, the prescription opioid pain pill crisis, then you're also going to be happy to see what they're relative to marijuana trying to do, and also their little brothers in big tobacco and big alcohol. Now, clearly, the pharmaceutical industry has been estimated to have killed roughly about 500,000 fellow Americans with their legal opioid drugs over the years. Not to mention causing tremendous levels of addiction and decay and just family breakdown all across the US. And if you think these companies are just putting a toe in the water, think again. They're actually diving into the deep end, trying to invest in what they think is going to be the new gold rush across our society, only this time it's green with marijuana. And, you know, last year, the pharmaceutical industry spent over $350 million in lobbying costs to Congress, head and shoulders above any other industry, about twice as much as the next closest industry, the defense contractors. You know, every time we have a mass school shooting in this country, the same cast of characters rush out in front of TV cameras to decry that the gun lobby has so thoroughly polluted and corrupted Congress that they are unable to pass so-called common sense gun control legislation. Well, anybody want to guess how much the gun lobby provided to Congress in lobbying dollars in 2022, $3.5 million. Now, clearly, that's still too much money, in my opinion. They need to take all that lobbying money out of Washington, D.C., but that's 100 times less than what the pharmaceutical industry provided to Congress in the same year. So if $3.5 million corrupts Congress, what's $350 million do? Next slide. Now, there's absolutely no doubt that the American pharmaceutical industry, principally Purdue Pharma with their OxyContin, spawned our current opioid crisis in the country. But the legal prescription drug phenomenon here actually explodes the myth that it's been the war on drugs that's been the problem, or even the illegality of drugs. The opioid pill phenomenon actually proves that every drug crisis, whether legal or illegal, is driven by two things: drug availability and drug acceptability. Not to mention the drugs themselves, which don't merely provide euphoria or intoxication, but godlike sensations. Next slide. Now, that quote comes from a former opioid addict who made that comment to a journalist, and at the same time also told him that he got a start on his drug-induced lifestyle by smoking weed at 13 years old. But that's a very insightful comment from the mind of a drug user right there, telling us how incredibly neurochemically alluring, how pleasurable drugs can be to the human brain. So pleasurable that many people choose to ignore the potential pitfalls, not just addiction, but death itself. Ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly why drugs have to be controlled, have to be made illegal in some form or fashion. Next slide. Now, the causal research demonstrating the link between drug use in our society and positive media messaging that normalizes and glamorizes drug use is absolutely unassailable. And of all the media genres out there, music is absolutely king. The average adolescent today listens to 2.4 hours of music every single day. And during the course of that time, according to one study, he or she hears a total of 84 explicit references to substance use, either neutral or positive in nature. That's 30,000 over the course of any year pounded into their brain and their private iPod worlds. And we think we're going to push back on that with one or two red ribbon campaigns in our schools every year. Folks, we're simply being outgunned every single day. Next slide. How about Hollywood? Oliver Stone's last movie, Savages, about the California marijuana trade, even had his female lead, Selma Hayek, worried that it would be seen as nothing but a crude sermon in favor of marijuana legalization, which of course it was. Oliver Stone's actually been agitating for many years for the legalization of all drugs. You know, the entertainment industry has a more powerful influence on our young people today than any other institution outside the home. And social media tends to amplify it all. Next slide. How about the news media? Several years ago, CNN's intrepid reporter here, Randy Kay, helpfully showed the world how to smoke weed through a gas mask bong in legal Denver, Colorado. This is not journalism. This is activism. This is the blatant promotion of an agenda. It's propaganda, pure and simple. You know, just this year, AP put out a poll showing that 75% of Americans no longer have any trust in mainstream media, and for good cause. Today's media doesn't so much put out news and information and facts for citizens to make their own decisions and determinations, but rather are promoters of narratives, telling us how we're supposed to think on certain issues and topics, like drugs. Next slide. Now, the Nazis didn't invent propaganda, but they sure as heck perfected it. Hitler's minister of propaganda here, Joseph Goebbels, understood that he who controls the media controls the message, and he who controls the message controls the masses. Two keys to every successful piece of propaganda are an appeal to emotion and endless repetition. As I said earlier, what the marijuana legalizing lobby has been so successful at doing. The far left is winning the arguments about marijuana because they control the media and the messaging. We have to do a better job at pushing back. Next slide. Now, if 15, 20, even 30% weed doesn't cut it for our darling enthusiasts anymore, that they figured out that running butane over marijuana leaf has been surprisingly effective at stripping out just that THC molecule. Or then they subsequently cook off or allow to evaporate that butane, leaving them with their wax, butter, shatter, vapes and dabs of every kind. Now, the marijuana folks will tell you that this is really no big deal. This is just like beer and wine is to mixed drinks. No, this is actually more like coca leaves are to crack cocaine. Next slide. Folks, here's the most expensive street drug in America today. Tetrahydrocannabinolic acid, THCA, $200 a gram. It is actually the synthetic precursor to pure THC, converts to THC upon combustion, where just a few grains of this stuff in a vaping pen or a pipe will get you blazed all day long. Or if you're not used to that kind of incredible purity, send you into a psychotic episode. Is this, you think, what compassionate Americans thought that they were legalizing? Next slide. Now, marijuana is a controlled substance, a Schedule I controlled substance, not because it's equal in every way in dangers and toxicities to other controlled substance Schedule I drugs like heroin, fentanyl, or mescaline, but because it still meets this three-tiered criteria that Congress established in 1970 in consultation with the medical and scientific communities. Now, marijuana is not different. It is not special. Unless we want to throw out the entire Controlled Substances Act, something that's been incredibly effective at both keeping dangerous substance out of the mainstream in society while simultaneously ensuring that medical science has the drugs that they need, which nobody's advocating for. Marijuana does in fact need to remain a Schedule I substance. Next slide. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no such thing. No other medicine in our pharmacological field has been approved for ingestion by smoking its raw form versus medicines that are carefully isolated, purified, carefully measured, and then administered in exact accordance with a particular illness or condition. This is just like the snake oil salesman of the 19th century, where we're supposed to believe that marijuana can cure any ailment for anyone at any time and in any amount. It's nothing but a triumph of propaganda. Next slide. The average medical marijuana user today is 30 years old, has been smoking weed for 15 years, and has absolutely no major medical condition. Recently, the commander of the U.S. Army Recruiting Command publicly stated that 77% of our young people, nearly 8 in 10, are currently unfit for military duty, either physically, meaning they're too obese or out of shape to pass the PT test, cognitively, meaning they can't pass the Armed Forces Vocational Aptitude Test, or morally, meaning they have an arrest record or are using some other type of illegal drug. Marijuana has been a huge driver in all three of those factors. You know, just prior to World War II, Franklin Roosevelt said that we cannot always build the future for our youth, but we can build our youth for the future. Are we still doing that? Next slide. In 2018, the Centennial Institute, which is a think tank in Denver, Colorado, did a very careful analysis showing the cost-benefit ratio of legal marijuana in legalized states as opposed to the costs upon society. What they found was for every dollar in tax revenue, legal weed costs that society $4.50, lost productivity, social, criminal, health-related costs of every kind. The supposed bonanza of tax windfall to local and state governments has completely gone up in smoke. And by the way, the numbers are similar in other states. Next slide. Now, it's important to note that even in legalized states, municipal governments constitutionally have the ability to opt out of marijuana distribution, simply not allowing business licenses for medical or recreational marijuana dispensaries. Even in my home state of California, far left utopia as it is, 80% of municipal governments have opted out of the legal marijuana trade. That's somewhat encouraging. Now, clearly, it's not a huge problem for marijuana enthusiasts to drive to the nearest big city to acquire their marijuana, but the quality of life issues and the organized crime that accompanies all of these marijuana dispensaries is something they can at least, at minimum, keep out of their communities. And increasingly they do. Next slide. Ladies and gentlemen, here's your wilderness on drugs. As I talked about before, 90% of all the weed coming out of California is on trespass grows, where organized crime simply goes in and grows weed, clear cuts the forests, and fouls the environment in every way. Next slide. And because we know that the California wood rat likes to feed on the mature marijuana stalks of these plants, you can't have that eating into your profits, can you? So rodenticides are widely used in all of these grow operations throughout the West Coast. And if anybody remembers the so-called spotted owl incident issue back in the late 1990s, where radical environmentalist groups were spiking trees to keep logging organizations from cutting down supposed spotted owl habitats, what you probably don't know today is that the spotted owl feeds on carrion, dead animals, like California wood rats, poisoned in marijuana grows. The spotted owl today has been decimated. They're completely more endangered and rare than they were back in the 1990s. When's the last time you heard any environmental group talk about the spotted owl and the cause of their demise? Next slide. And because we know it's easier to bring your butane canisters up to the marijuana grow site to be able to make your marijuana concentrates, you can't be bothered hauling your butane empties back down the valley. This particular grow location here sparked a forest fire, one of many every single year throughout the West, burning tens, if not hundreds of thousands of acres every year. Once again, where are the environmentalist groups on this? Next slide. As far as I'm concerned, no one, absolutely no one who claims to care about the environment can justify the marijuana industry at the same time. Next. Ladies and gentlemen, our greatest enemies in the struggle are actually not the drug cartels or even the narco terrorists. It's our own societal ignorance and indifference. And as we know, those are both contagious. But so are courage and engagement. You can push back. You must push back. Every night in your city, there are parents praying that their children not get exposed to drugs. You can help be the answer to those prayers. Next slide. Now, I believe that one day the citizens of this nation will come to wonder how their leaders, in the name of supposed enhanced revenue and expanded liberties, could have ever supported the legalization of a drug that is in every way more detrimental than beneficial. How their morally corrupted leaders, their selfish elites, and their irresponsible media did not just encourage, but facilitated their society's descent into what Alexis de Tocqueville so warned us against, an infantilized and degraded population willing to accept a soft yet stultifying despotism. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to Glynis for any questions or further discussion. Glynis, take it away.
Thank you, Jeff. That was so engaging and informative. Thank you so very much, and no scary pictures, except for that picture at the end with all of the canisters of butane. That was frightening. But actually, it is 8 o'clock, so we don't have time for questions. I am so sorry, but I would like to leave you with one thought. I know, ladies, that you may not realize this. I did not realize this until I started doing some research working up to this program. There is a federal farm bill that has been passed that actually makes marijuana legal everywhere in some forms. So go look that up. Go look up the federal farm bill. And it's kind of a loophole to get some forms of THC out there it's not marijuana per se, but it's like gummies and candies and things with THC in them. And our kids are eating this stuff. You can get it at the 7-Eleven or at the, on the corner of the dollar store. It's crazy. And it really is very frightening. And it is something that we all need to be engaged on. And we cannot close our eyes, and we can't forget, and we can't leave it for someone else. We have got to all be very vigilant on this subject. So if you enjoyed this month's Empower Hour, please join me next month, September 12th. We will be discussing graduate level voting. That means not the easy stuff, but the complicated stuff, unraveling rhetoric from action. So come join us next month on Tuesday the 12th, where we talk about graduate level voting. And thank you again, Jeff, and thank you, Erica and Kim, and everyone who helped with the program. You all are wonderful, and appreciate your coming and joining us for our program Empower Hour on your Tuesday evening. And until next month, bye.